You can walk every single day. You can take the stairs. You can feel perfectly normal every morning. And your leg veins can still be failing valve by valve, millimeter by millimeter, while you go about your life completely unaware. The heaviness you feel by 3 in the afternoon, the swollen ankles by dinner, the legs that feel like they're filled with wet sand by the time you sit down to watch television, that is not a sign of being out of shape. That is your second heart failing. Most people have never heard those words. By the end of this, you will understand exactly what your second heart is, why it starts breaking down specifically after 55, and you will have the 3-step second heart protocol, the exact sequence I built after 2 years of going through the clinical literature that your doctor does not have time to explain during a 15-minute appointment. Stay with me because the mechanism behind this is not what you have been told. Let me start with what is actually happening inside your legs right now. Your heart pumps blood down to your legs through your arteries. That part works fine for most people past 55. The problem is getting it back. Blood has to travel from your ankles all the way back up to your heart against gravity through a network of veins that run the full length of your leg. And here is the piece almost nobody explains clearly. Your heart is not powerful enough to pull blood back up from your feet on its own. It does not have the suction pressure for that. So your body evolved a backup system, a second pump, and that second pump lives in your calf muscles. Every time your calf contracts, when you push off the ground to take a step, when you rise onto your toes, when you climb a stair, it squeezes the deep veins running through the muscle tissue. That squeeze creates a pressure wave that pushes blood upward against gravity toward the heart. Vascular physiologists actually have a name for this. They call the calf the peripheral heart. That is not a poetic metaphor invented by a wellness blogger. That is a clinical designation based on measured pressure output. A healthy calf muscle contraction produces enough force to propel venous blood upward at roughly 30 millimeters of mercury, which is approximately the same pressure difference between your heart's chambers during a resting heartbeat. Your calf is, in a very literal mechanical sense, doing half the work of returning blood to your heart every time you take a step. Now picture what happens when that pump starts failing. Picture a sump pump in your basement that runs at 30% capacity while the water level keeps rising. That is your lower leg by 4 in the afternoon. Now here is where things go specifically wrong after 55 and why the timeline matters. Between the ages of 50 and 70, muscle mass declines at an average rate of 1 to 2% per year in adults who are not doing targeted resistance training. But it is not just total mass that matters for the calf pump. It is fiber type. The muscle fibers that generate the forceful, high-pressure contractile squeeze needed to drive venous return are type 2 fibers, the fast twitch ones. And type 2 fiber loss accelerates dramatically after 50, declining at nearly twice the rate of slow twitch fibers in the same time period. Research published in the Journal of Applied Physiology has documented this preferential fast twitch atrophy in aging muscle, and the implications for your legs are direct and specific. A weaker calf generates less squeeze pressure per contraction. Less squeeze pressure means less blood moved per step. Less blood moved per step means blood begins to accumulate in the lower leg over the course of the day. And blood that sits too long in the lower leg creates exactly the sensation you already know, the ache, the heaviness, the fatigue that hits whether you exercised that morning or not. But the muscle weakness is only the first layer of this problem. There is something happening inside the veins themselves that makes the muscle decline dramatically more consequential. Your leg veins are not simple tubes. They are lined with a series of tiny valves. Imagine dozens of small trap doors, spaced every few centimeters along the interior of the vein. These valves open upward to let blood move toward the heart, then close to prevent it from sliding back down between contractions. When they are healthy and tight, this system is remarkably efficient, but these valves are made of delicate connective tissue, specifically tissue supported by elastin and collagen fibers, and both elastin and collagen production decline measurably after your mid-40s. The valves become looser. The leaflets, each valve has 2 of them like the saloon doors on a Western set, stop closing cleanly. Instead of snapping shut with authority, they droop slightly, allowing small amounts of blood to leak backward between each calf contraction. Vascular surgeons call this reflux. When it is happening across enough valves along enough veins, the cumulative effect is that blood pools in the lower leg faster than the weakening calf pump can push it upward. The efficiency of the entire return system degrades simultaneously from two directions at once. The pump gets weaker, while the pipes get leakier. And here is a number that should recalibrate how seriously you take this. According to estimates from the American Venous Forum, chronic venous insufficiency, the clinical designation for this combined valve and pump failure, affects up to 40% of women and approximately 17% of men in the United States. This makes it one of the most prevalent vascular conditions in adults past 50. It is also proportionally one of the most under-discussed. Your doctor will often tell you that your legs feel heavy because you are sitting too much or because you are getting older. Both of those statements are technically true. Both of them are functionally useless. They describe the problem without naming the mechanism, and without the mechanism, there is no rational basis for a targeted fix. Now I need to introduce the invisible villain in this story, because the valve deterioration and the muscle atrophy are the damage. But there is a third process that is the cause beneath the cause, and it is something you have almost certainly been told is fine, or simply never thought to question. Chronic, low-grade sitting. Not the acute kind, not the 12-hour airplane flight where your calves visibly swell, the kind that affects nearly every adult over 55 who has what looks on paper like a reasonably active lifestyle. You walk in the morning, you do the grocery run, and then you sit for 3 to 4 hour blocks in the afternoon and evening with minimal leg movement. And here is the mechanism that makes this specifically destructive in a way that your morning walk does not counteract. When your legs are still, when you are seated in a standard chair with your knees bent at roughly 90 degrees, blood accumulates passively in the lower leg veins. A standard seated position also partially compresses the popliteal vein behind your knee, restricting one of the main venous return pathways. Within 60 minutes of sitting in this position, researchers at Indiana University demonstrated measurable reductions in brachial artery flow-mediated dilation, a validated marker of how well your blood vessel walls respond to flow demands. But more relevant to leg heaviness specifically, venous pressure in the lower leg climbs continuously while you sit still, because there is no muscular assistance pushing blood upward. The valve leaflets are being held against a passive column of blood by gravity alone. The longer this continues, the more those valve leaflets are exposed to what vascular specialists call hydrostatic stress, the mechanical pressure of a blood column sitting above them for hours at a time. Over months and years, this cumulative stress accelerates valve leaflet deterioration beyond the pace of normal aging. The sitting that feels like rest is mechanically aging your vein valves faster than walking would. You are not recovering. You are wearing down a specific structure while you sit there watching television. So here is the cruel geometry of the typical post-55 lifestyle. Your morning walk improves symmetrics. Your afternoon sit degrades a different set of structures. These are not opposite forces that cancel each other out. The valve deterioration accumulates. The pump weakening accumulates. And the pattern of moderate morning activity followed by prolonged afternoon sitting is precisely the daily rhythm that modern furniture, modern entertainment, and modern work-from-home setups have constructed around you. The convenience was engineered into the environment. The biological cost was never disclosed. Now I want to tell you the thing that the mainstream conversation about heavy legs almost entirely misses, because this is the point where what you have been told is not wrong. It is just incomplete in a way that keeps the problem in place. We have been told that compression stockings are the primary treatment for heavy legs after 50. Your doctor has likely mentioned them. Every pharmacy sells them. And they are not wrong in the narrow sense. Compression does mechanically support the vein walls, reduces the diameter of distended veins, and this mechanical support helps the valve leaflets close more fully. That mechanism is real. But compression is a passive fix for an active, progressive problem. It addresses the symptom in the moment. It does not rebuild the pump. And the dominant clinical framework has been compression first, followed by vague lifestyle guidance that sounds like this. Stay active, elevate your legs when possible, avoid long periods of standing. What that framework misses, and what a body of exercise physiology research has been accumulating since the early 2000s, is that the specific type of muscle contraction determines nearly everything about how effectively the calf pump functions. Not all movement generates equivalent venous return. A leisurely flat ground walk engages the calf, but the contraction amplitude at an easy pace is relatively modest. Research groups studying lower extremity hemodynamics, including work from the University of Exeter on peripheral vascular responses to exercise, have consistently documented that full-range heel raises, specifically rapid raises that bring you fully onto the ball of the foot, generate significantly higher venous ejection fractions than casual walking. The ejection fraction here refers to the percentage of pooled blood that the calf pump actually clears from the lower leg with each contraction. A complete forceful heel raise clears measurably more pooled blood per repetition than a walking step at a comfortable pace does. And yet the heel raise is rarely prescribed as a primary intervention. Walk more is still the dominant recommendation. The mechanism behind why the heel raise is superior gets lost between the specialist who knows it and the patient who needs it. Let me now go deeper into a parallel system that adds a completely different quality of heaviness to your legs, one that most people have genuinely never considered as part of this problem. Your lymphatic system. This is a network of thin vessels that runs alongside your veins and collects excess fluid from the tissue spaces between your cells. Throughout the day, fluid leaks out of your capillaries into the surrounding tissue. This is a normal part of how nutrients reach cells. The lymphatic system's job is to collect that leaked fluid, filter it through lymph nodes, and return it to the bloodstream. When it is functioning well, your tissue fluid balance is maintained. Your legs feel their normal weight. When it is sluggish, the fluid builds up in the tissue itself, not inside the veins, but in the space between cells. That is the puffiness you see around your ankles by evening. That is not blood pooling in the vein. That is tissue edema, fluid sitting in the tissue because the lymphatic drainage could not keep pace with the leak. And here is the mechanism that makes this specifically relevant to the age-related changes I have been describing. Your lymphatic vessels have no dedicated pump of their own. They move lymph fluid through exactly three mechanisms: rhythmic compression from surrounding muscle contractions, pulsation from nearby arteries, and breathing-related pressure changes in your chest cavity, which means that if your muscles are contracting less because of the type 2 fiber loss I described, because of those long sedentary afternoon blocks, your lymphatic drainage rate slows proportionally and automatically. The two systems degrade together. Venous return slows, interstitial fluid accumulates in the tissue, and the leg begins to carry an actual measurable load of pooled fluid by mid-afternoon that is completely separate from the blood pooling in the veins. Research measuring lower extremity lymphatic flow velocity using lymphoscintigraphy, a nuclear imaging technique that tracks a radioactively labeled tracer through the lymphatic vessels, has demonstrated that sedentary periods of as little as 2 hours produce detectable reductions in lymphatic transport rates in the lower leg. This is not a theoretical downstream effect. It is measurable on imaging within a single afternoon of inactivity. You are building a small flood in your own tissue incrementally every day the pump is not activated. Now I need to take you one layer further down to the molecular level because there is a process specifically accelerated after 55 that makes every system I have described substantially less efficient, and it involves something that won a Nobel Prize in 1998. In that year, 3 American scientists, Robert Furchgott, Louis Ignarro, and Farid Murad, received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for discovering that nitric oxide is a critical signaling molecule produced by the cells lining the interior of your blood vessels. These cells are called endothelial cells, and they form the inner surface of every single blood vessel in your body. When they produce nitric oxide in adequate quantities, it diffuses into the smooth muscle wrapped around the outside of the vessel and causes it to relax. The vessel dilates, blood flows more easily. Venous return improves because the veins themselves are offering less resistance to the calf pump's push. After 55, endothelial nitric oxide production declines measurably. This has been documented across multiple studies, with supporting evidence published in journals including Hypertension and the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. The decline is driven by several converging factors. Oxidative stress, the cellular equivalent of internal rusting, caused by an imbalance between free radicals and antioxidant defenses, increases with age and destroys nitric oxide molecules before they can act on vessel walls. The enzyme that produces nitric oxide, called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, is expressed at lower levels in aging endothelial cells. And because blood flow itself has slowed due to the pump and valve failures I already described, the mechanical shear force that blood exerts on vessel walls, which is one of the primary signals triggering nitric oxide release, is also reduced. Less flow means less shear force, which means less nitric oxide, which means stiffer vessels, which means less flow. It is a self-reinforcing loop. The pipes tighten around the failing pump at exactly the moment the pump can least afford the added resistance. When you add these four layers together, declining calf muscle power and mass, deteriorating vein valve function, sluggish lymphatic drainage, and reduced nitric oxide availability, what you get is a system where the heaviness in your legs at 3 in the afternoon is not one problem. It is four converging failures expressing themselves in the same tissue simultaneously. And the reason standard advice produces partial results at best is that it addresses one layer, calls it done, and leaves the other three untouched. I want to stop here and tell you something from my own experience because this is where the research stopped being abstract for me. When my husband was in cardiac recovery, under full medical supervision with a cardiologist directing his care, and I want to be clear that his outcomes were specific to his situation and results genuinely vary. One of the first things I noticed reading through his follow-up protocols was how completely his leg symptoms were overlooked. He was reporting afternoon heaviness, lower extremity fatigue, mild ankle swelling by evening. 3 different specialists attributed these symptoms to his medication stack. One of them was probably partially correct, but none of them named the mechanism. None of them explained what was happening inside the vein valves, or what his calf pump was or was not doing, or why his lymphatic system was slow, or what his nitric oxide levels had to do with any of it. Without the mechanism, we had no basis for knowing whether things were improving, staying the same, or slowly getting worse. It was only when I went through the hemodynamics and vascular physiology literature myself, and I mean the actual journal papers, not the summaries, that I understood these four systems were simultaneously compromised and that each one had a specific, evidence-backed point of intervention. Not a replacement for his care, not a miracle protocol. Real leverage points that the research describes clearly and that almost never survive the translation into a standard appointment. That is where the second heart protocol came from. And I want to give you the biology behind each of its 3 components before I give you the specific numbers, because a protocol you understand will be a protocol you actually do. Before I get to the protocol, there is one more mechanism I want to explain because it directly determines how fast the protocol works and how durable the results are. It is happening inside the individual cells of your calf muscle, at the level of its energy-generating structures. Mitochondria are the organelles inside your muscle cells that convert oxygen and fuel into the energy currency that powers contraction. You can think of them as the engine rooms. Their density, how many engine rooms exist per unit of muscle tissue, determines how quickly your muscle fibers can sustain repeated contractions without fatiguing. After 50, a process called mitochondrial biogenesis, which is the creation of new mitochondria, slows down. The existing mitochondria also become less individually efficient due to accumulated damage in their own genetic material. Research from Mayo Clinic's physiology laboratories has documented that sedentary adults over 60 show mitochondrial function deficits of approximately 30 to 40% compared to physically active adults of the same chronological age. What this means for your calf specifically is that when you try to use it as a venous pump, the muscle fatigues faster than it should. It generates a strong first few contractions, loses power, and the pump rate drops. Blood continues pooling. The heaviness you feel is partially the result of a muscle that cannot sustain its own function long enough to clear what gravity is sending to your lower leg. But this is also where the most important piece of good news lives, and I want to give it to you with the precision it deserves, rather than as vague encouragement. Mitochondrial density is one of the most training-responsive variables in aging muscle, and in some studies, the relative response to training stimulus in older adults matches or exceeds that seen in younger adults, partly because the baseline deficit creates more room for adaptive gain. The molecular switch that initiates mitochondrial biogenesis is a protein called PGC1 alpha, and it is activated by the mechanical stress of muscle contraction, specifically by the repeated, forceful contractions that occur when a muscle is loaded through its full range of motion. 8 to 12 weeks of consistent targeted calf work produces measurable increases in mitochondrial enzyme activity in the calf muscle of older adults, according to studies measuring direct tissue markers of mitochondrial function. Your legs can feel materially different within a time frame that is shorter than one television season, not because something has been tricked, because the engine rooms are being rebuilt. There is also a class of molecules released by contracting muscle tissue that most people have never heard of, called myokines. These are proteins and peptides secreted by muscle cells, specifically during and after contraction. Your muscle is not just a mechanical pump, it is also an endocrine organ that releases signaling molecules into the bloodstream when it works. One of the most studied myokines, irisin, has been shown in research originating from the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard Medical School to improve vascular function by promoting endothelial health. Another, the muscle-produced form of interleukin-6, which behaves very differently from the inflammatory interleukin-6 released by fat tissue, improves glucose uptake and exerts anti-inflammatory effects in surrounding tissue. When your calf is contracting robustly and repeatedly, it is simultaneously acting as a mechanical pump, pushing blood upward, and as a biochemical signal improving the quality of the vessel walls that blood has to travel through. When it is weak and sedentary, it stops doing both jobs at once. The heaviness you feel is the signal that two functions have been lost simultaneously from the same tissue. Now, I want to address something that is specifically relevant to adults over 55 in 2026 and that did not appear in the leg health literature in quite this form 15 years ago. Extended daily sedentary time in this age group has measurably worsened over the past several years. Studies tracking daily step counts and sitting duration in adults over 50 in the United States show that average daily sitting time increased by roughly 1 to 2 hours per day between 2019 and 22, and follow-up surveys suggest this increase has only been partially reversed since. What this means practically is that a substantial cohort of adults currently in their late 50s and 60s has been operating in precisely the valve-stressing, lymphatic slowing, muscle atrophying sedentary pattern for 5 to 6 additional years compared to the generation before them at the same age. The accumulated baseline damage is higher than the existing research on older adults fully accounts for. The starting point for many people doing this protocol is further back than a decade-old study on sedentary aging would predict. That matters for expectation setting, but it does not change the mechanisms of recovery. And if anything, the research on anabolic sensitivity in aging muscle suggests that the window for meaningful biological change with appropriate stimulus remains wide open well into the 70s. Now, let me tell you about dietary nitrates, because this is the piece of the second heart protocol that surprised me most when I went through the research, and it is also the most immediately actionable component in terms of speed of effect. Your body produces nitric oxide via two distinct pathways. The first is the endothelial pathway I already described, the enzymatic one that declines with age. The second is a dietary pathway that bypasses the failing enzyme entirely. When you eat foods rich in inorganic nitrates, leafy green vegetables like arugula, spinach, and beet greens, and notably beetroot itself, your salivary bacteria convert those nitrates to nitrite. When that nitrite reaches your stomach and then enters your bloodstream, the acidic environment and the presence of deoxygenated hemoglobin convert it to nitric oxide through a non-enzymatic chemical reaction. This pathway does not require endothelial nitric oxide synthase. It does not decline the same way with age. It functions as a backdoor into nitric oxide production that remains accessible well into your 70s and 80s, provided you are consistently feeding it the right substrates. A meta-analysis published in the British Journal of Nutrition, synthesizing data from multiple randomized controlled trials, found that dietary nitrate supplementation from beetroot juice consistently reduced diastolic blood pressure and improved exercise performance in adults, with the magnitude of effect showing particular strength in older populations, which makes mechanistic sense because the relative gain from restoring nitric oxide availability is larger when the endothelial baseline is lower. Research from groups at Liverpool John Moores University demonstrated that beetroot-derived nitrate improved blood flow specifically to the lower extremities during exercise, with the mechanism being exactly what the pathway predicts: more bioavailable nitric oxide in the vessel wall, more vasodilation, less resistance to the calf pump's venous push, and more efficient lymphatic flow because arterial pulsation, one of the three drivers of lymph movement, is stronger when vessels are dilated and flow is better distributed. The effect is not marginal. In one controlled study using high nitrate beetroot juice, lower extremity blood flow during exercise improved enough to measurably extend time to fatigue in the calf muscles. That translates directly into less afternoon heaviness through a chain that is now easy to follow. Less fatigue means more pump contractions per hour. More pump contractions means lower venous pressure in the lower leg. Lower venous pressure means less hydrostatic stress on valve leaflets, and less lymphatic back pressure means the interstitial fluid drains more efficiently. Now, I also need to tell you what blocks this pathway, because this is where the consumer health environment specifically works against people over 55 in a way that is almost never disclosed, and I find it genuinely absurd that it is not. Antibacterial mouthwash. Specifically, the kind used twice daily, which is the dosing frequency on most commercial bottles and the frequency recommended by dental marketing. The antibacterial agents in standard mouthwash, most commonly chlorhexidine or cetylpyridinium chloride, do not selectively target harmful oral bacteria. They broadly reduce the bacterial population of the mouth, including the nitrate-reducing bacteria on the tongue and in the salivary crypts that perform the first conversion step in the dietary nitrate pathway. A study from the University of Exeter published in Free Radical Biology and Medicine found that twice-daily use of antibacterial mouthwash reduced nitric oxide bioavailability and produced a measurable increase in systolic blood pressure within 1 week. 1 week. The bacteria that convert your dietary nitrates are the functional foundation of the only largely intact nitric oxide production pathway you have after 55. Using a product that kills them twice daily is, from a vascular physiology standpoint, like blocking the fuel line to the backup pump. I am not telling you to stop brushing your teeth. I am not anti-dental hygiene. What I find amusing in a completely bleak way is that this product is sold in every pharmacy next to everything else promising you a cleaner mouth. And the vascular implication is on no label, in no advertisement, and in no conversation between dentist and patient, because the incentive to communicate it does not exist anywhere in that transaction. The people who know this are vascular researchers. The people buying mouthwash are not typically cross-referencing vascular research at 9 at night. There is one more mechanism to cover before the protocol, and it is one of the fastest acting points of leverage in this entire system. It is the relationship between hydration and blood viscosity. Blood viscosity is a measure of how thick your blood is, how much resistance it offers to flow. Thicker blood moves more slowly through veins. Slower moving blood accumulates against valve leaflets with more static pressure. It creates more pooling for the same amount of calf pump output. The physical analogy is exact. Imagine trying to push honey through a garden hose using the same pressure you would use to push water. The pump doing the work is identical. The resistance it is working against is completely different. Mild chronic dehydration raises blood viscosity measurably, and adults over 55 are chronically underhydrated at rates that are dramatically higher than in younger adults, not because of behavior, but because of biology. The thirst mechanism weakens with age. The osmoreceptors receptors in the hypothalamus, the sensors that detect when blood concentration has risen above normal and trigger the sensation of thirst, become less sensitive in the decades after 50. This has been documented in research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. which showed that older adults required significantly higher plasma osmolality, meaning their blood had to become meaningfully more concentrated before the thirst sensation was triggered compared to younger adults. What this means in practice is stark. By the time you feel thirsty as an adult over 55, you have typically already passed the threshold at which blood viscosity has climbed and venous return efficiency has already dropped. You cannot use thirst as your hydration signal. It has become an unreliable sensor. Your calf pump is regularly working against thicker blood than it needs to, and you have no internal alarm telling you this is happening. A body weight-based hydration target, specifically approximately 35 milliliters per kilogram of body weight per day, distributed across the day in scheduled intervals, rather than consumed in response to thirst, is one of the fastest ways to reduce blood viscosity and improve the mechanical efficiency of the venous return system within 24 to 48 hours. This is not a 2-month adaptation. This is fluid physics responding immediately to a change in fluid volume, which is part of why people following the second heart protocol notice changes in how their legs feel relatively quickly, not because of anything that could reasonably be called dramatic, but because the basic hydraulic environment of the venous system has been improved before any structural remodeling has had time to occur. All right, here is the second heart protocol. 3 components, built from the 4 mechanisms I have just described. Each one is specific and numbered because vague instructions are not instructions. The first component is called the pump activation sequence. This is not a workout. It is a targeted activation pattern for the calf in its role as a venous pump. 3 times per day, morning, midday, and mid-afternoon, you perform 25 rapid heel raises. Full range, you rise completely onto the balls of your feet, hold for 1 second at the top, and lower over 2 seconds. 1 up, 2 down. This is not a slow stretch. It is a full, forceful plantar flexion that brings you onto the metatarsal heads with enough force that you can feel the calf engage to its end range. 25 repetitions takes approximately 90 seconds per session. The research on venous ejection fractions from lower extremity hemodynamic studies shows that this specific movement pattern, full range, loaded, relatively rapid, clears approximately 60 to 70% of pooled blood from the lower leg per set. You are simultaneously acting as your own pump operator and providing the contractile stress that activates PGC1 alpha for mitochondrial biogenesis. 1 movement, 2 mechanisms. The critical mistake that invalidates this component, performing it seated. Seated heel raises do not produce the same venous ejection pressure because the popliteal vein behind the knee remains partially compressed by the chair throughout the movement. The standing position is not a preference. It is a mechanical requirement for the pump to work the way the anatomy requires. Hold a countertop if you need balance support. But stand. The second component is called the drainage window. This is an elevation protocol designed to work with the passive anatomy of both the venous system and the lymphatic system simultaneously. Twice per day, once in the afternoon and once in the evening, you lie on your back and elevate your legs above the level of your heart for 12 minutes. Not resting on a pillow, not a slight incline, specifically above the heart. The geometry that achieves this is resting your calves on a couch arm or propping your feet up on a wall while your hips are on the floor. The specific angle that phlebology research, the clinical study of vein diseases, identifies as effective for passive venous drainage is approximately 30 to 45 degrees above horizontal, which corresponds roughly to the height of a standard sofa arm when your back is on the floor. At this angle, gravity is doing the work that the calf pump does when you are upright. Venous pressure in the lower leg drops. The valve leaflets close cleanly because the hydrostatic pressure column has been removed. The interstitial fluid that built up in the tissue over the preceding hours begins moving into the lymphatic capillaries because the pressure gradient that was blocking its entry has been relieved. 12 minutes twice daily is 24 minutes of passive drainage working in the direction of gravity rather than against it. The reason most people skip this component is that it requires lying down in the afternoon, and the cultural assumption is that lying down in the afternoon is indulgent, That assumption has a biological cost. Mechanical maintenance is not indulgence. The third component is called the vessel feed. This addresses the nitric oxide pathway and the blood viscosity problem simultaneously through three specific dietary actions. First, one serving of high nitrate vegetables daily. Beetroot, arugula, or spinach are the best studied options. The specific instruction is to chew thoroughly before swallowing, because the salivary conversion of nitrate to nitrite requires contact time between the food's nitrate content and the bacteria coating your tongue and the inner surfaces of your cheeks. Swallowing quickly reduces conversion efficiency. Second, eliminate antibacterial mouthwash or replace it with a non-antibacterial fluoride rinse used at night only, which preserves the nitrate-reducing bacterial population while still supporting dental health. Third, calculate your baseline daily fluid target at 35 milliliters per kilogram of body weight. A 70-kilogram adult needs approximately 2.4 liters of water per day, and distribute this intake across scheduled intervals rather than waiting for thirst. The scheduling is not optional hygiene advice, it is a behavioral compensation for a physiological sensor that has become unreliable. Set phone reminders if needed. The goal is to drink before you want to, because the biology of your thirst mechanism after 55 has created a systematic delay between need and signal. The single most common mistake that invalidates the entire protocol is doing all three components intensely for 3 days and then spacing them to once or twice a week as the initial novelty fades. The mechanisms being targeted require consistency for different time horizons. The hydration and nitric oxide effects are rapid. You are changing fluid physics and substrate availability, and those changes express themselves within 24 to 72 hours. The drainage and pump effects produce noticeable symptomatic changes within the first week for most people who are consistent, because you are actively reducing the fluid load your legs are carrying each day. But the deeper structural changes, mitochondrial density, vein valve stress recovery, endothelial responsiveness, accumulate over 8 to 12 weeks of repeated stimulus. A protocol done 3 days in a row and then forgotten is not a protocol. It is an experiment with a sample size of 1 and a conclusion that will be wrong. The results, when the protocol is applied consistently, come in recognizable layers. Most people who do all three components daily report reduced afternoon heaviness within 3 to 5 days. This is the fluid physics and immediate pump clearance effect. Over 4 to 6 weeks, the legs feel lighter earlier in the day, and the evening swelling is reduced. This is the mitochondrial and lymphatic adaptation beginning to accumulate. At 8 to 12 weeks, the baseline quality of how the legs feel throughout the day shifts in a way that the earlier weeks do not fully capture. This is structural. The valve stress is lower, the pump is genuinely stronger, the vessel walls are more responsive. The difference between week 3 and week 10 is not the same feeling amplified. It is a qualitatively different mechanism expressing itself. I think about this every time I read through vascular physiology research, because I find it genuinely remarkable, in an amused, slightly baffled way, that the calf has been called the peripheral heart in clinical literature for decades, that this terminology appears in standard vascular physiology textbooks and is taught in medical schools, and that the average adult over 55 who brings heavy legs to a physician appointment leaves with a recommendation for compression stockings and a vague instruction to stay active. The mechanism never enters the conversation. The pump is never named. The valve deterioration is never explained in terms the patient could use to understand their own daily experience. The patient goes home, puts on their compression socks, continues their 3-hour afternoon sits, wonders why the socks help somewhat but the heaviness never really resolves, and concludes that this is just aging. It is not just aging. It is 4 converging biological failures, each of which has a specific leverage point, most of which have been identified in peer-reviewed literature for years, and none of which fit inside a 15-minute appointment that was billed for something else. This is not a conspiracy. The system is not suppressing the information. The system is simply structured in a way where the incentive to explain the mechanism to you does not exist at the point where you need it most. Physicians are trained to treat disease. Leg heaviness that is not causing a thrombosis is not a disease in any billing code. It is a quality of life complaint, Quality of life complaints get generic answers. Generic answers do not require mechanism. And without mechanism, you cannot fix anything. You can only manage symptoms with products. You now have the mechanism. You have 4 biological systems explained with enough precision that you can trace the logic from cause to symptom to intervention. You have a protocol with specific numbers, a specific common error, and an honest timeline for what to expect at each phase. The legs that are heavy right now, in the chair you are sitting in, are not inevitable. They are the output of 4 systems that all have identifiable inputs, and 3 of those inputs you can change before this week is over. If you are going to start the Second Heart protocol this week, comment Second Heart below so I can see who is actually doing this. And if you subscribe, the next video does the same thing for the 2 o'clock energy crash, a completely different system, a completely different point of failure, and a mechanism that most people have had exactly backwards their entire adult lives.